story. You're a writer of human depth, and you specialize in creating characters that we seem to know inside out. But you're also doing a few things differently in this novel, and I'm interested in talking about those. Let me give just a brief plot synopsis for those of you who haven't read it. The book hasn't been out that long. The plot really could hardly be simpler. An American college student, actually a college dropout, named Lindsey Litvak. She dropped out from Wesleyan, so we have some point of local contact here, is spending a year in China, 2 years really, so she's in her second year, teaching English, and she's badly injured in a hit-and-run accident. Her divorced parents, Aaron and Claire, immediately head over to Shanghai, which is where the accident happened, to try to help their daughter, who's in a coma in the hospital. While they're there, they try to figure out, first of all, what happened to her, the mystery of how she was injured. But they also try to figure out the sort of unfolding mystery of what kind of life she was living there, actually, which turns out to be not what they thought. So there's sort of a double mystery to this. And in the process of their learning about their daughter's life, we learn about all of them. So that's the setup of Rabbit Moon. You write in an afterword, I think, that you began writing the novel when you visited Shanghai, which you call an astonishing city. And you write, furthermore, "The months I spent there changed me profoundly. No place in the world has so inspired me to write." I think people are always interested in what gets a novel going, what causes that explosion of ideas and associations that Nabokov spoke about, an idea growing the wings and claws of a novel. What was so astonishing and life-changing? I know you well enough to know you're not prone to hyperbole. What was so astonishing and life-changing in your stay there, and what specifically inspired you to write Rabbit Moon as a response to that?
Okay. So Rabbit Moon is a novel I wrote completely by accident. I had gotten this fellowship to go to Shanghai in 2016. I had never been to China before. I had never experienced an Asian megacity. I grew up in a town with 4 traffic lights. Okay, so I am the original small town person. And I got this fellowship to go to China. Now, when I went there, I was already working on another novel. And this is normal for me. I travel a lot. I always just continue writing the book I'm writing. But this was the first time where that was not possible. So I was writing this novel, Mercy Street, and it's a book set in Boston. It is the novel that won the Mark Twain Award. So I was writing that novel in 2016, and I intended to just work on that in Shanghai. Wow, was that not going to happen? I saw that very clearly. Being in China was not a detail in the way that travel sometimes can be for me. This was not a place that I could block out in any way. This is a mega city of 30 million people. If you can conceive of it, it makes New York feel like a sleepy backwater. It is a city on steroids. And so there is right away the kind of the sensory experience of being in this city with this extreme congestion. You walk down the sidewalk at 3 a.m, it is crowded. You take the subway at any hour of the day or night, and you feel the city pressing in on you. So this was an extraordinary experience, not altogether pleasant, I will admit, but impossible to ignore. So it was clear to me that if I was going to write at all in those 3 months, I was going to have to write about where I was, because there was no way to block it out. I didn't want to. I wanted to be in it. So I started writing this story. Now, the time I spent in Shanghai, I was invited by the Shanghai Writers Association. I was one of 10 foreign writers who were there in the city. And we had no obligations in these months except to, I guess, write and go to some dinners. I love dinners, so I did that. But I had these oceans of time for writing. And for the first time in my life, this was weird too, I was able to write in public places. I've never done that before. You see these writers in cafes, right? Who have the latte and they're scribbling some pages and it looks like so much fun. I hate them. I hate those writers. How do you even do that? How do you write about some imaginary world when there is life all around you? I can't do that. I eavesdrop. I'm nosy. I watch people. In China, there was zero possibility of me eavesdropping on anybody because the Chinese language defeated me completely. Like, I could not even pick out words. So for the first time in my life, I could be in public, watching people, feeling life all around me, but still be able to keep my own language in my head because I couldn't take in any of the language that was ambient. So I was writing every day in tea houses, in train stations, in public parks, and I started composing this story that drew on this place I was in. What happens in a situation like that where you're very isolated by language, or at least to me, you get lonely. It is a particular kind of loneliness where you're isolated by language. And I'm such a verbal person, so stimulated by language. Language was a brick wall to me in China. So I was driven to write because I wanted to have a conversation. There was no way to have a conversation. So it was like writing a letter to a best friend you've never met. And that was what the experience of writing these pages was like. It was my hunger to have a conversation. So I was writing about the life that was happening all around me and some of the strangers I saw. Now, this building I was living in Shanghai was an apartment tower, which, like a lot of buildings in China, had on every floor a mix of businesses and apartments. So I was on the 23rd floor, but I was 2 doors down from a hair salon. I got very interested in the comings and goings of people from this hair salon. One of the people I saw every single day was a very beautiful young Chinese man, very androgynous looking, maybe in his early 20s. I saw him in the elevator. I saw him outside smoking cigarettes. And he was the spark that started the story for me. The character of Johnny Dew in the story was suggested by this young man I saw every single day. I don't know the first thing about this guy. I made it all up. So my basic orientation as a writer is to do a ton of research. Had I seen this guy and become fascinated by him in Boston, I would have contrived some way to have a conversation with him and ask him questions. There was no way I could do that. So I went on imagination and observation. And that's where the character of Johnny Dew came from. There was also a young woman I would see from time to time in my building. A young Western woman with long red hair who looked totally out of place in Shanghai, beautifully dressed, knocking on a different door every time I saw her. And she became the inspiration for the character of Lindsey, who is the young American woman who was hit by the car on page 2. So that is not a spoiler. It is literally the first thing that happens in the story. So that is kind of where the story began, in Shanghai, spotting these strangers and becoming fascinated with them and fantasizing about them.
You were there for 3 months?
Yeah.
So at the end of that 3 months, after all this furious writing, did you have the rudiments of the novel? What did you have?
I had a mess. I had a hot mess. I did have a lot of story. I realized when I was writing that, I could hear the clock ticking. I knew I had only so long in Shanghai. I wanted to use my time well. So I wrote faster than I ever had. And it was messy. I wrote these very incomplete scenes. I couldn't make sense of what I was writing, but I did not want to stop because the time was limited. So I wrote a lot of pages very quickly. I never do this. And then I got back to Boston, and I had started this other novel, Mercy Street, that I wanted to finish. So I put these pages in a drawer for like 5 years. I've never done this. And honestly, I didn't at all believe it would work, because in the past, when I've started to write something and put it down, I come back to it even 6 months later and I think, who wrote this? What is this? I don't care about this. This means nothing to me. So I was fully prepared to come back to these pages 5 years later and throw them away. But that didn't happen. And this was extraordinary for me. I looked at these pages, and there were a lot of pages. They were messy. But I could see exactly what was missing, where the holes were, what needed to happen, what I needed to do. That has never happened to me in my life. And this is my 8th book. So this was extraordinary for me by any measure. This was nothing at all like the writing process of anything I'd ever done before. And it's really hard, 8 books in, for it to feel new. It's almost impossible. But there was something about traveling to this place where I have never felt so disoriented and so foreign and so lost. There was something about that that kind of lit up my brain. So, yeah, it was a completely uncharacteristic writing process. I'm sure it will never happen to me again.
You know, I think of the kind of fiction you write, and I've read about half of your oeuvre. I've read 4 books. You've read 8, so half. Because I have some work to do still. But I think of you as being an immersive kind of writer, and by that I mean we're immersed very fully in the lives of your characters, in their minds, in their thoughts, their backstories. Your fiction typically would seem to both convey a intimate and deep knowledge of place, of character, and also require it of you. Mercy Street, which had to do with events and people surrounding a women's health clinic in Boston, you had actually worked at one, so it drew deeply on your own experience. Baker Towers, I think, it can be seen as a kind of valedictory novel to the part of Western Pennsylvania that you grew up in, that you called Pennsyltucky, and you know so much about the way people think there, the politics of the place, the history, the locales. So I think of you as the writer who draws on and creates depth. What was it like to try to create that same kind of depth in a place that in some ways you knew almost nothing about? What were the challenges of that?
It was terrifying, honestly, because there was no way for me to fake deep knowledge of China. Are you kidding? There's no way. The only way I could write a story set there was to write about clueless Americans like myself who were completely in over their heads. And that's what I did. So it's about this experience of being displaced, of being lost, of feeling deracinated, cut off from your roots. It's the experience of travel, you know, and any of us who have traveled internationally have had this experience of feeling completely out of place, completely lost, and at sea. So it's that feeling of disorientation that was really pivotal in writing this story. It wasn't writing about a place I understood. It was writing about a place that I felt overwhelmed by and completely ill-equipped to deal with. And so the characters in this novel, particularly Lindsey's parents, they're in China for the first time. They don't speak a word of Chinese. They have a daughter who is in a health crisis. And they're trying to negotiate the healthcare system in a completely alien environment. They understand not the first thing about how anything works. And for me, that's a perfect setup for a novel. Because really, for me, a novel is about the moment after which nothing will ever be the same. And for this family, it's very clear what that moment is. It's the moment their daughter gets slammed by this car, this unknown driver who just speeds off. And there she is, lying on the sidewalk. That is the moment after which nothing is the same. So that's what I knew when I started writing. I knew where the story began. I had no idea what happens next, which is fairly typical for me. I figure it out in the process of writing the story. I don't make an outline. I figure it out as I go. But so that setup that I just told you, that's everything I knew when I started writing.
One of the functions I think the book has for American readers, certainly for me, is a kind of travel guide. And some of the most enjoyable writing you do is descriptions of places, both of the sometimes bafflement and disorientation of the American characters. The one scene where Aaron, the father, who owns a tech company that has just been sold to a much bigger tech company, and he's a guy who's used to being decisive, knowing everything. He walks through a street in China, and every interaction he sees, he misjudges, he misapprehends, and it's extremely aggravating and confusing and even anxiety producing for him. So there's that. There's the experience of a sort of discombobulated American abroad. But then there are times when you just describe a scene like the People's Park and the chess games on the huge chessboards, and then the poker players, and you describe how prevalent spitting is. And the poker players spit more emphatically and at longer distances than the chess players, who have a more demure way of spitting. And then there are older couples who are waltzing in the middle of the day to music. And then in another scene, you have one of your characters who's just torn by grief, I guess Claire, the mother, and she goes to a Chinese movie that has English subtitles. And the movie is completely bewildering. It's a drama, and you describe it in the climactic scene, the protagonist sits for a math exam. And so there are a lot of sort of travel guide nuggets of enjoyable and informative things that clearly come from your notebook. I guess my question is, A, did you really enjoy that kind of travel writing part of it? And B, how do you know, is there a point at which a novel can sort of smack too much of the notebook? How do you sort out and balance the stuff that you're bringing, from your travel book to the elements of fiction that are necessary for the story that you're trying to tell?
Well, it's all point of view. I mean, that's what novel writing is. That everything that I describe in the novel is because some character notices it. So it's not just this kind of objective observation, it's that you're in the head of one of these characters who is trying to navigate this city. So that's my favorite part about novel writing. It's seeing the world through a particular character's eyes. And I think if you're going to find any commonality at all among my novels, that's it. It's this kind of exercise in empathy, where you're going inside a particular person's head and you're seeing these surroundings through that particular person's eyes. So example of this is Lindsey's mother, Claire, is a frustrated writer. She's somebody who's her whole life has wanted to write, and she's somehow never managed to write anything. Yet she lives in this constant state of failure because she's not writing. And she's walking through a Chinese park, and she sees a very old man who is doing calligraphy on the sidewalk in water. He has a long brush, and he's writing on the sidewalk. And it's so hot in Shanghai in the summer. It's evaporating before your eyes. And so it's not just some random person seeing this calligraphy on the sidewalk, but this is somebody whose whole life has been defined by the failure to write, and this kind of clinging to every scrap of anything she's ever written. And this idea that someone would write anything just to have it evaporate is inconceivable to her. It jams all her gears. How is that even possible? It is so utterly alien to her. So she sees that in a way nobody else would see it. Somebody whose life is defined by the failure to write anything. And so that's when the observation matters. It's when it's in the head of somebody to whom this means something unique and particular that tells you something about who she is. It's not just travelogue, hey, this is what happens in China, but it's how this particular person in this environment, in this moment, perceives this.
So we spend a lot of time in the heads of Claire and Aaron. And I have a very short passage I would like for you to read, but I want to talk about your picture of marriage in this novel, which I think we'd have to say is comprehensively dismal.
It's not about marriage, Rand. It's about divorce. And
it's about divorce.
I love writing about divorce. I want to say,
it's
my favorite thing.
As a divorce counselor or as a divorce portrayer, you are extremely fair. And there's a very deft use of alternating chapter points of view to present his view of her. They've been divorced for how many years?
Going on 4.
Going in for, and her view of his. And it's like when you're reading one, you see all these terrible faults of the other, and you think, oh, I wouldn't want to be married to her. And then you get her chapter, and you think, I wouldn't want to be married to him. So there's sort of, dueling destructions going on. And I, after 20 years of marriage, there's very little left other than well-worn mutual knowledge of each other and an intimacy that has bred contempt. And I'm not sure there's a question here, except the question is, Jen, you're recently married, right? I think Josh is right over there. But I would like you to read a section I marked it on page 182. Great. It's only about 4 paragraphs, and at this point, Aaron and Claire are outside the hospital, and there's a long part of this novel where Lindsey is in a coma, and they're getting ambiguous news from doctors. There may be brainstem damage. She may recover. She may not recover. And one of the things that that propels the novel is the dreadful uncertainty about what the outcome for Lindsey is going to be. So they're depleted by anxiety, and they're standing outside the hospital. I think I've marked it off there. Yeah.
Oh, I like this passage. Okay. The area around the hospital is bustling, ambulances coming and going, delivery trucks idling at the curb. Aaron leans back against the brick wall of the building. The sidewalk is clogged with foot traffic, pedestrians in business attire, in workers' coveralls, in operating scrubs. A few wear robes and slippers, lucky patients who are still ambulatory, healthy or desperate enough to step outside for a smoke. Aaron finds this remarkable. He is full of such observations, a running commentary on the astonishing differences between the U.S. and China. The massive crowds of pedestrians waiting at every intersection, waiting for the light to change. The surprising number of retarded adults navigating the streets on their own. What? He says, seeing her frown. I can't say retarded. Mentally challenged, Claire says. Aaron continues, undeterred. Are the rates of retardation higher in China? Or are the retarded simply more likely to live at home and be part of society rather than being institutionalized? Then again, maybe he's wrong. Maybe the number is proportional. Maybe he's just seen so goddamn many people that, statistically speaking, a large number of retarded ones are bound to be part of the mix. Claire thinks, please stop talking. A man pulling an IV pole asks Aaron for a light. He reaches for his matches, still blathering. It isn't just the retarded. Hasn't she noticed the large number of spinal deformities? The untreated cases of scoliosis and kyphosis? Healthy women in the prime of life with malformed bodies, bent sideways or with a dowager's hump. The way you'd look, he tells her, if you'd been born here. Claire flinches. Her scoliosis was detected in the 7th grade, a routine screening by the school nurse. She spent a miserable, pointless year of her adolescence in a Milwaukee brace. When that didn't work, she had surgery to straighten her spine. Right? Says Aaron. He seems to be waiting for something. It takes her a moment to understand that she's supposed to be grateful, impressed that he remembered this fact, any fact, about her childhood. Claire, who'd been his wife for 20 years. He studies her, frowning, as though he truly doesn't understand, maybe he doesn't, that the words are hurtful. Oh, for Christ's sake, what's the matter? Why do you remember that? Claire says. Of all the things to remember. Oh, here we go, Aaron says. Marriage.
So, if you take like the 10 worst moments in your marriage in the past year and just put them together, you pretty much have the divorce situation. But above all, it is this dire knowledge of the other person, knowing exactly what the other person is going to say, and it's going to be the wrong thing. They're standing outside this hospital, and he just won't shut up about everything. He has to comment on everything that he's saying, and it's just devastating. But then in the next chapter, you get her from his point of view, And
That's equally bad.
Yeah. So I mean, you've often been praised, and very accurately, for having such sympathetic access to your characters. But it's true even when they are desperately fallen characters, mired in a horrible mutual knowledge of each other, and we get to know them so well, also for better and for worse. Which segues to my actual question. That was an observation, but I think people needed to get a taste of what's on display here. Lindsey, their daughter, who's really the central character, we know her parents so well, but I find her to be much more elusive. She's 20 years old when she goes over there. She's an attractive, likable, smart, suburban kid, sort of spoiled by her parents in the attractive ways that kids are. And she drops out of school and goes abroad, and almost overnight, she takes up a lifestyle. She ends up working in a very twilight dimension of the economy, doing things that are dangerous and risque. And we're left with a lot of questions, like, how did she become so tough? What drives her to do this? What enables her to do this? So there's the mystery of what happened to her, but there's also the mystery of her. And I don't necessarily need you to answer all those questions that I just listed, but what are the challenges of creating a main character, especially for a writer who specializes in knowing their characters inside out, who at some level remains fundamentally elusive and not graspable?
I think she is graspable if you understand what it is to be a teenage girl and a young woman. If you do understand those things, she is very graspable. At the center of this story is the intense vulnerability of being a young woman. And Lindsey in particular is a very beautiful young woman. And in a way, it is like having a target on her back. And so you see that a lot of the choices she's made in her life would have played out very differently if she were less physically striking. And her mother is very aware of this. She has this thought at one moment, her daughter is beautiful. It is the best and worst thing that can happen to a girl. And that has certainly been true in Lindsey's life. So a lot of the really questionable choices she has made in her early adulthood have to do with stuff that has happened to her as a teenager. And that's not that unusual, I gotta say. So one thing I will reveal, and I'm always hesitant to say too much because I know a lot of folks have not read the book yet. It's sort of newly
we're tiptoeing around some spoilers.
We are. But I will let this go. One thing that happened to Lindsey that was very formative, as a teenager, she got into a sexual relationship with a much older man, too old for her, friend of her family, married guy. And this was the moment where the train jumped the tracks for her and also for her family. And so I'm not going to say too much more about that, but the choices Lindsey makes are related to the stuff that's happened to her. And the stuff that's happened to her is related to the way she looks. And this is true for all women at every moment of life in a way that is less true for men. That what you look like physically as a woman can be so determinative. And it has been in Lindsey's life. So I'm going to leave that at that. I realize as we talk about this family, Lindsey and her parents, there's another important family member I've not mentioned. And this is Lindsey's sister, who is the first other family member we meet. She is off stage for part of the story because she's a much younger sister. She's 11 years younger than Lindsey. She is stuck at summer camp in New Hampshire while her parents have, in a panic, gotten on a plane, gone to China to find out what happened to their daughter who was hit by a car. Their younger daughter is at camp. Grace is much younger than Lindsey. She's also adopted. She was adopted as an infant from China right around the time so many American families adopted daughters from China. 2005, 2006 was sort of the height of these foreign adoptions. So this relationship between Lindsey and her much younger adopted sister Grace is really central to the novel. It is the healthiest relationship in this supremely messed up family. And I thought I would read just a tiny little bit about that to give you some sense of grace. This happens early in the novel. This is when Lindsey, right after the accident, Lindsey's in the hospital in Shanghai. It's so awkward because the last time I did a book tour, I didn't need reading glasses. The comatose girl breathes deeply. A student nurse washes her arms and legs. The long limbs are slender and heavy. Her pale skin smells of milk. The student nurse studies the character inked on her shoulder. Except for a scraped elbow, her body shows no sign of trauma. All the damage happened above the neck. The comatose girl dreams of rabbits. They're her little sister's favorite animal. Grace is 11 and enchanted by them. For months now, she has lobbied their mother for a pet rabbit, so far without success. Lindsey met her at the same instant their mother did. Grace was then 7 months old, living in a state-run orphanage in Chongqing. There exists in some family album a photo taken that morning, Lindsey with a ponytail and a mouthful of braces, holding her new sister, Grace with pink eye and a persistent rash on her cheek. Invisible in the photo is Grace's scar, a white circle at the base of her neck, the size of a pencil eraser, where she'd been burned with a cigarette. She was not an abused child, they were told through an interpreter. Her birth mother had marked her so that she could be identified later, in this life or the next. Who was she? Lindsey asked. The interpreter relayed the question to an attendant who responded at length. That she couldn't understand the answer was the great regret of Lindsey's life. The interpreter's translation was 4 words long. She was very poor. Later, when Grace was older, their mother taught her the Chinese legend of the red thread, an invisible cord that connects each person to her future, to all those destined to love her in the course of her life. From the day Grace was born, the red thread connected her to the Litvacs. She was meant to be Claire and Aaron's daughter and Lindsey's sister. Of course, no one mentioned Grace's birth mother, the very poor woman so desperate to keep her that she'd burned her baby with a cigarette. This detail would have ruined the story, would have proven definitively that the red thread could be cut. So that's Grace.
You know, I think an interesting motif that comes up through the book is sort of the divided or partitioned self. Lindsey adopts a new name for the new life she's had over there. She's called Lily. Johnny, who's gay but doesn't want his traditional parents to know, comes up with a whole story he tells his parents about a girlfriend he has in the United States who's in college. And of course, Johnny is not his real name either. And he refers to this alternate life he has as his imaginary self. Grace is cut off from the life she was born to and living a totally different life. The only people who don't have sort of alternate imaginary partition selves are Aaron and Claire, and they're not that well off. There's an interesting way in which to adopt a strategy of having an imaginary self, a different self, another identity that you can deploy and put out there is almost what, like a strategy for dealing with pain, or a strategy for accessing adventure or living a more creative life. It figures throughout your novel, really. Normally we think of partitioning and compartmentalizing as bad things, ways that we are able to ignore things that are threatening to us. But it seems to have a much more positive valence in your novel.
You know, it's a function of being young. That's the difference between Aaron and Claire and these other characters. Aaron and Claire are grown-ups. They're in their 50s. Their lives are formed. Lindsey is 22. Her friend Johnny is about the same age. Grace is younger. There is something about the condition of being young. What do you experiment with identities? You you aren't anybody yet, so you sort of try out different people you might be. And so these younger characters in the novel, they experiment with identities, they go by different names, they have different ideas of who they might grow into. And so I'm very interested in writing about people Lindsey and Johnny's age, in their early 20s, because it's a time of life when none of the questions have been answered yet. Everything's still on the table. And as a young person, you're aware of that. So you try things. There's a period of experimentation that can be protracted. For some of us, it can go on for a long time. But I think it's very common when you're 22 years old to realize there are any number of paths my life could take, and they're all kind of interesting, and they all seem equally possible.
I have two more questions, and then we'll turn it over to you. We did start at 7 after the hour, so we're going to snag 7 additional minutes here. Having read prior novels of yours, I am, as I said at the outset, really interested in how different a novel this is for you. Years ago, I remember hearing the Connecticut poet Donald Hall talk, and he was an older man by then, and he talked about how in the middle part of his career, he found himself increasingly desperate to, and these were his words, make a new noise. And he said that whenever he would start to write a poem, it would tend to gravitate back toward his same old self, doing the things, albeit good things, that he's always done. How to break out of that, how to make a new noise. This novel is different in a lot of ways. There's the foreign setting, the way you wrote it, as you described it, is different. There are elements of mystery and crime fiction that aren't prevalent in your novels. There are very short chapters, sometimes with cliffhanger endings that give a certain propulsive quality that I don't normally associate with your novels. And it's all highly cinematic. That Washington Post review that was great referred to your narrative that's almost like a fast-moving camera. And honestly, your prose also seems somewhat different to me. A little brisker, a little more compact, with like capsule summaries of characters in some places that are very enjoyable. Did this just happen, or at a certain point, is it a conscious effort to make that new noise? How does that work over the course of a long writing career?
It really did just happen in this case, and I think it had everything to do with what I was saying earlier about writing in public. The pace of life in Shanghai was so unlike anything I had ever experienced. And because I was writing this novel out in the world, I think I internalized it. So when I look at this novel now, it kind of moves like a flip book. Remember flip books? You know, there are line drawings on every page, and you flip through the pages really quickly, and you see them move. And that's what this novel felt like to me. And it didn't come from me. It came from... It was ambient. It came from Shanghai, because now I'm writing something else, and I'm not writing at that pace. It is very much a reflection of where I was and what I was soaking in. You know, I think fiction writers are like the box of baking soda in the refrigerator. You know, you just soak in whatever's ambient. And that's a lot what was happening in this novel. So the pace of this novel was a surprise to me. It was not a conscious choice. It completely took me by surprise, and I just kind of went with it. But it was not something I decided to do. It just sort of happened in the process of writing.
The result, it ends up being more of a page turner than I'm used to experiencing with your novels,
yeah.
and I mean that in a good way. It has most of the virtues of your fiction, but it also is more propulsive.
Yeah.
I have a last question. It's sort of a cultural zeitgeist question. About the state of writing, reading, and literature in the digital age. I was writing a review for the New York Times recently. It was a short review of a novel, and my editor there, Dave Kim, great guy, had edited, and he'd taken one paragraph and he'd broken it down into 3 separate short paragraphs, and that made no sense to me. And I said, can we rejoin that paragraph, because really it makes a point. It gives illustrations of the point, and then it draws it together. That's one entity, and if you break it up, it makes no sense. He said, yeah, we can do that for now. He said, but we're getting some feedback from our data people, and they say that most of the users of the New York Times Book Review these days are using it, not reading it, using it on their phones, and they find the long paragraphs extremely interruptive and difficult to handle on those devices. This seemed like a note of doom for me, from the writer's point of view. Your novel begins with text messages. It meditates on the death of handwriting and the epistolary life. The novel is shorter than other books of yours, with shorter chapters, a simpler prose style. Is this an ominous time for reading, writing, novels, attention spans, and literature? Or is it more like, look, there's always something that's ominous. There's always the death of the novel. It never happens. What do you make of the moment we're in terms of communication, language, attention spans, AI? Are you more in the stay calm mindset, or more in the we are sliding over the brink mindset?
The answer is yes. Yes to all the above. So, yes, I find all of this ominous. And yes, there's always something. And yes, storytelling will continue, and writing and novels will continue. People are reading. And this is an interesting discovery of COVID, that, you know, people were reading. People were, book sales were up, even though a lot of the mechanism of book promotion was interrupted. People were reading. So, I don't know, it's always in flux. It's very clear to me when I was writing this novel, and of course I didn't know this at the time, it's a pre-COVID novel. It's a story set in Shanghai before COVID, when we didn't know COVID was even coming. And lockdowns in Shanghai were a whole other order of magnitude from anything we experienced in this country. It was far more draconian and more life-altering than anything we had. And yet I was writing this novel in a place of innocence. I had no idea that was coming, of course. I was writing about Shanghai at this very, open, dynamic period in its history that would never, that would be interrupted by COVID and possibly not return to the way it was. So I think what you said is true. There is always something, and we don't know what changes are around the corner. And of course, the changes in the way we live are reflected in the way we write. But I'm not demoralized. I'm confused, and I don't know what's coming. But I think great books are being published now, and people are reading them. So it doesn't seem all that bad.
Questions from you guys for Jennifer?
Yeah.
So you talk about the fact that you changed because you wrote in Shanghai. It's very different, something you've never done. You wrote a great book. Congratulations. But you said you went back to writing another book. Now you're back where you were. Do you feel compelled, nonetheless, to find another place of isolation to write another, or to have a similar kind of experience, to go to some other place where you don't know the language, where the experience is different in some way, to put yourself in that situation again? Would you do it? Do you want to?
I would love to do it. I think this particular experience cannot be replicated, in part because Shanghai and China generally is, given the political moment we're in now, it's a hard place to get back to. I'd love to go back. The odds of me getting a visa to be in China for any length of time, things being as they are now, are not good. But I do fundamentally believe in the value of travel. I always have. And in fact, I was one of those kids who did a junior year abroad in college. And that was like a pivotal moment for me in my development as a young writer. And it was partly the shock to the system of being in an unfamiliar environment and the fresh eyes. And that, more than anything, is a benefit of travel for writers. You observe in a way you cannot possibly when you're in a familiar environment. So that is a real benefit. And I love to travel. I do it when I can, and at least every year. And it's something I will do again, and I think it has had a great effect on my writing even before Rabbit Moon. So yes, that's absolutely something I will want to continue to do. But every experience is singular. And this particular moment of being in Shanghai, I think that I'm so glad I went when I did, because I don't think it exists now. Like, one of the crazy things about Shanghai is the rate of change. So even while I was there, it was very clear to me that this city is remodeling before my eyes. On a daily basis, you see a brand new looking building being torn down, being replaced by an even newer building, and it keeps happening. And even then, I remember thinking, if I come back here in a year, I won't recognize anything. Well, here we are 9 years on. I don't think I could even get my bearings now. It's the rate of change. So, every moment is has something to offer you as a writer, and don't miss it because it will not be repeated.
When you wrote the book, you said in 2016, and then you had a mess of pages, and you just put them in a drawer. Did you type it, do it on a computer, handwrite it, or what?
So the initial pages I wrote by hand, which I've always done a lot of, I believe in. I love writing by hand. And because I was out in public places, it was the most expedient way to do it in a little notebook. I did transcribe those pages kind of later in the day. So I would write in the morning, go back to my apartment, transcribe what I had, and it would change a lot in the process of transcribing. It would be sort of a second draft in one day. And then I didn't look at it again. And I would just do that day after day after day. So when I went back to it 5 years on, it was, I had an electronic version of it. I had a file. It was a mess, but it was there. It was typed. It was usable. And that's fairly typical for me. I always do a lot of writing by hand. And I always do kind of a second draft in one day and then put it aside and move on in the story.
Other questions? Writers have such different ways of composing the novels. Nabokov was famous for writing things on note cards, and then would arrange the note cards around. I heard Ann Beattie, a novelist and short story writer I've always admired. One time she gave a reading in Boston I was at. Someone asked her how long it had taken her to write the novel, and she said, "You don't want to know because you'll hate me." And the answer was like 3 weeks. And the person said, "Well, do you outline?" She said, "No, I just start writing." So some people just simply start writing and it just pours out of them. Carol Phillips, the British Caribbean writer whom I know slightly, he's quite a bon vivant, travels all around, and every 5 years he holes up in like a 4-star hotel for 6 weeks in Thailand and doesn't emerge, or somewhere like that, and doesn't emerge until he's got a draft of a novel. He just writes for like 17 hours a day. There are so many different. Hemingway famously wrote his 500 words a day, every day. There's many ways to write as there are writers.
And most of them don't work. Most of those ways don't work. Almost nothing works. Writing a novel is so hard that if something works once, you will do it until you die. Because it is a very hard thing, and it remains hard. I mean, I'm working on my 9th book now. It is not easier. It is in no way easier. And that's has been one of the horrible surprises of writing novels, is you think it should be, right? You write one novel and you think, okay, now I know how to write a novel. Yes, you do. You know how to write that novel, but only that novel, and it's not portable. And so, everything I think I know about writing novels I only concluded because it worked once.
Do you think that's demoralizing or thrilling?
Yes. It is demoralizing or thrilling.
I see your approach to interviews.
Yeah.
Dichotomy? Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
They do stay with me up to a point. The way I say goodbye is like a clinical depression, usually. That's my strategy. Because I do always feel bereft. When I finish writing a book, I feel an incredible sense of loss. And I think it's because my whole life is organized around the writing of novels. So every choice I've ever made as an adult has been to facilitate that. So that when I'm writing a novel, everything in my life makes sense. And when I'm not writing a novel, nothing in my life makes sense. Like it is just, the whole thing kind of breaks down when I'm not writing. So the thing I hate most is finishing, because then it means I won't have a novel. Like I have grown to love the long, boring middle, where nothing happens, the phone doesn't ring, your agent won't take your calls, your editor doesn't remember your name. I love that part. That's great. Or just to be left alone with the same mess you were working on yesterday. That's what I like. I don't like starting. I don't like finishing. I would just like to live in the middle.
Do you have something like an next novel after this?
I do.
Ideas?
I do. I have a novel started. Typically, when I deliver a novel, there's a lag time between when I deliver the pages and when the book actually comes out in bookstores. And that can be anywhere from a year to like 2.5 years sometimes. So I always try to have something else going. Probably the best piece of advice I've ever gotten about living as a writer is always to have something going in between books, because otherwise you start to feel like a former writer. So if you have a book come out on your pub day and you don't have something else started, that's a bad feeling. So I always am in something in between books. In this case, I've had quite a while to get started on something else, because normally Rabbit Moon would have come out in September of 2024. But because of the election, a lot of publishers were pushing fiction back to the spring. So I had a little more time, and I did get started on something. So I have this novel going. I'm excited about. It's a hot mess, but I'm really eager to get back to it. Yeah.
What authors that inspire your writing, and what are some of your most favorite books you've read recently?
Okay, like I love that question, and also if you asked me tomorrow, it would be a totally different answer. So there are writers I go back to again and again because I feel like they still have more to teach me. And in that category, I would put Faulkner and Russell Banks and Don DeLillo and Alice Munro, Toni Morrison. So that's sort of like the short list of writers I go back to again and again and again. What happens to me, though, is when I'm writing a novel, I always zero in on one or two published novels that seem to hold all the secrets for the book I'm trying to write. So when I was writing my novel Heat and Light, those two novels were Underworld by Don DeLillo and Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. And I went back to those novels again and again and again in the 5 years I was writing Heat and Light. To the point where I had a copy of Underworld in my writing studio and one in my bedroom, and I kept one in my car and one on my phone and one on my iPad, because what if I need it? So that has happened to me with every book I've written. I identify one or two novels that I read over and over and over again obsessively. But then I sometimes will never look at that novel again once I've finished writing my book. It's just that it had something to teach me in terms of the book I was trying to write. And often when I have trouble getting going on a new novel, it's because I haven't yet found that book or those one or two books. I think of them as my scriptures for that book. I haven't found the scriptures. And so I kind of haven't gotten my legs under me in my novel yet. But once I find the one or two scriptures, then I feel like that I have a set of instructions, even though they may be written in a language I don't understand, but there are instructions. So that happens to me every single time. I always identify one or two books that will help me. But those are some of the writers that I go back to again and again. I would also mention Ian McEwan, who's a writer I idolize because every book feels sui generis. Like he's never phoning it in. This guy's published, 15 novels. I don't even know how many novels. I don't love them all equally, but I do love them all and admire them all. And every time I feel like he's risking something, it may or may not work, he's never phoning it in. So he's probably Hall of Fame for me, like that writer that I will always buy his new book the day it is published in hardcover because I cannot wait for the paperback.
It's interesting, your list is a really diverse list. And sometimes I think for writers, you admire certain writers who do things that you don't do, that you would never do, and then there are other writers you like because they're kind of in your sweet spot, and they're doing things sort of similar to what you do, and I see that in your list. I don't think of you as a Don DeLillo writer. It's interesting to me that you're inspired by him, and in a very direct way. Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you've been talking a lot about your novels, and you've also written a great book of short stories.
Thank you.
And they're linked, and they're also related to Bigger Towers, so Biggerton, those folks. And so I'm wondering what your origin story for this was. What led you to write this book?
So I have always been a short story writer. I was a short story writer first, before I ever attempted a novel. So I've been writing them for years and years. 3 of my books are set in Western Pennsylvania, where I grew up. Those are the 2 novels, Baker Towers and Heat and Light, and this story collection, News from Heaven. News from Heaven is made up of 10 stories. A few of them have characters that appear in the novels. So the way that story collection came about, I had published this novel, Baker Towers. It was my second book. It was published in 2005. And I thought for years that I wanted to write about my hometown, the place where I grew up. So after I wrote Baker Towers, I thought, okay, I'm done. You know, I don't have to write anymore about that sort of complicated and heartbreaking place I grew up in. But what happened was, in the couple years following that novel being published, I heard from a lot of readers who wanted to know what happened to those characters. What happened to Joyce? You know, what was the story with her brother Sandy, who's sort of a cipher in Baker Towers? He has this mysterious life, and where is he? What is he doing? So I wrote one story about the brother Sandy Novak in Baker Towers, just one story. And that led me to write another one, and it led me to write another one. And so pretty soon I had, you know, maybe 5 stories related to the Novak family in Baker Towers. But I found, though, that those were connected to other stories set in that place that had to do with what became of that town in the years after Baker Towers. So it's a coal mining town where the coal mines fail, because that's what's happened to all coal mines. So a lot of the stories in Baker Towers have to do with the further life of this town of Bakerton, Pennsylvania. What happened to this town after its reason for being is no more? What happens to the people who are born and raised in this coal town, who are still living there after the mines die? Then what happens? So that's really was the origin story for that book. All of them. The question is, are any of my characters based on me, myself? The answer is all of them. Every character I've ever written, those are my thoughts. That's my way of seeing the world. People who know me very well see bits of me in all my characters. So, you know, there's always a mix of invention and reality. If you're writing realistic fiction, you know, the life you have to work with is the life you yourself have lived. So I write about my life all the time in these kind of hidden ways. I also lie all the time, because I'm a fiction writer. I'm allowed to do that. And I encourage you, if you are writing fiction, lie all the time. You know, it's part of your job as a fiction writer. You get to do that. And no one needs to know ever what is invented and what is lifted from life. Because if you've lived it, if you've observed it, if you've thought it, it is yours to use in whatever way you wish. And the invention is part of it. The lying is part of it. That's something you're allowed to do. Yeah.
How much do your agent and editor change your story, and how much do they turn it in as pretty close?
They don't change a thing ever. They give me advice sometimes, which I take or don't take, but no one ever changes a word except me. I have an agent who's a really good reader. He's also a novelist and a memoir writer, so he gives me the kind of feedback a writer gives, rather than sometimes agents tell you, oh, well, this is good, but I can't sell it. I don't get that kind of feedback from my agent, because he is fundamentally in his heart a writer. So he gives me very writerly feedback, and I use a lot of it, but not all of it. What he's very good at doing is putting his finger on something that isn't quite right. He might suggest a solution that I would never do, but he's not wrong about the problem that he has identified. So it's really useful feedback, even if he's not literally telling me what to do.
You have the last word.
Always, always, absolutely. No one changes a comma unless it's me. So even when the manuscript is completely done, it goes to a copy editor who will give me suggestions like, hey, you might want to put a semicolon here. Which I never do because I hate semicolons. But I might put something else there. You know, it might be an M dash. But no one is going to put in that M dash except me. And that is one of the few powers you have as a writer of fiction. Your work is your own. It's next to your own body. Nothing will ever belong to you as completely as something you have written. So no one else gets to change it. You know, there weren't two. There was only one in this case. And it was a novel by Emily St. John Mandel called The Glass Hotel. And there isn't a lot of commonality between that book and this one, but there is something about the sensibility. And I think if you read both books side by side, you'll feel it. It's a palpable thing. Yeah. I also looked at some Graham Greene short stories, but hers was the only novel that I found truly instructive in writing this book. Yeah.
I'm curious about your, growing up, did you read all the time? Did you know you wanted to be a writer? And when did you write? How old were you?
I read all the time. I always wanted to be a writer. The only things I remember wanting to be before I wanted to be a writer, I wanted to be either a genie or someone who pumps gas. Those were my first two ambitions. Writer was my third choice. And I think the genie thing, like that has never really left me. It's like one of the things that I always thought would be great about being a genie. I saw someone did the blink. We all grew up on the reruns of I Dream of Jeannie. One of the things I always thought would be great about being a genie would be to be able to be invisible and watch people when they don't know you're watching them. And I still think that would be great. Like, that's the superpower I would ask for if I could choose one.
Well, that's what you're doing.
That's what I'm doing, exactly. And as far as the pumping gas, well, it's like you need a skill. And when I was growing up, that was still something you could get a job doing. Now, not so much, except in New Jersey, where you still can. So, it's a plan B.
Jen, some people might not know that before you became a novelist, you worked for magazines in New York City for a number of years. Can you say anything about how that contributed to your formation or deformation as a novelist?
It's like that's the only time I've ever
Which
really
magazines?
had a job. So I worked for Condé Nast in New York. I had two really good magazine jobs that I really enjoyed. One, I was the fitness editor at Men's Health magazine. I was the first and only female fitness editor they ever had. So I loved that job, actually. I loved the guys I worked with. That was a great job. And then I was an editor at Self magazine. And I really enjoyed both of those jobs. But that's the last time I've ever gotten a paycheck, really, so that's part of my fond memory of them. I can't say they really fed into my development as a writer. They sort of pointed to me that, no, really, there's something else you could do with your life where you would really get a paycheck. So no, I don't know that really fed into this in any way. It was sort of what I did when I tried to talk myself out of writing fiction, because writing fiction is a whole lot harder than writing for magazines. At least it was for me. So it was my attempt to, do the same thing and get a job. And looking back on it, those magazines don't even exist anymore in the same way they did then. Like, it's not a career that is even a thing anymore. It's almost like I was trained to be a blacksmith or a court jester or something, like a completely impractical skill set that seemed practical at the time.
Well, thank you very much. Jennifer is going to be signing books out in the hall. I know some of you have books already. They're also for sale in the bookshop. And we just want to thank Jennifer Haigh for continuing her relationship with the Mark Twain House to the delight and benefit of all of us. And it's been terrific having you here.
Thank you.
Just want to say before we close up, please join us again for an upcoming event. We have lots going on in the summer. On May 14th, we have an in-person talk with Twain scholar Kevin McDonnell about Twain's works that draw on Mark Twain's writings, characters, or image, but isn't actually by him. On May 22nd, we'll have a virtual talk with journalist Michael Lau about his latest book, Strangers in the Land, Exclusion, Belonging, and the Epic Story of the Chinese in America. And then in June, we'll have our talk with Ron Chernow, and pretty soon, I'm going to put on sale our talk with Joyce Carol Oates, which will be on June 20th. So be on the lookout for that. And that's it for this evening. Thank you for joining us.